A new movie adaptation of one of Stephen King's short stories is now out in theaters, but is it worth your time? Hello and welcome to Cinema, where we focus on a film. I'm Josh, this is Simply Cinema. Let me know down in the comments below what you thought of Stephen King's The Monkey. Is it good, is it bad, or somewhere right in the middle? Let me know all your thoughts so we can have a nice discussion down in the comments. Be respectful of each and everyone's takes coming from different places. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. And getting right into the synopsis. When two young boys come across this toy monkey that kills someone after you activate it, their lives change forever, even 25 years later, once they figure out how things infest their lives and the way that it works. And getting right into the positives, there's a way that this film tackles its subject, everything that's going about with this toy, that it's horrific by the nature of the creepy nature, this innocent toy monkey that can do so much wrong in the way that it all comes about. It's not necessarily explaining how things happen, how it becomes that supernatural terror that it actually becomes part of it. But even though I'm not familiar, haven't read the short story itself, it still introduces itself in a way that makes sense for the longevity that starts off with this prologue having a cameo of Adam Scott that really builds upon the tension, upon the horror right off the bat, gives you a nice cold open to the movie as well for what ultimately comes and becomes a terror later on in a movie. And the way they build upon those horrific moments, directed by Osgood Perkins, it's just really well directed, has the great cinematography that you expect him, having recently directed Longlegs as well. And so how you're just exploring this element of horror has great positive visual effects, the way that the practical elements of body parts or blood or other things just float on throughout just makes it an effective horror movie in the sense that you're really hooked onto the story elements and other things that really builds upon the characters, kids almost being kids even if they're cursing or going into this bad behavior, and all of that keeps the story constantly motivated to move forward with its pacing and just captivate the way you're engaging with the plot as a whole. And going into the mixed elements, this is a horror comedy, which I wasn't familiar as much with the comedy part, knowing that was part of the film. And so with that, some people will have ill taste, such as myself, with how it all floats on throughout. Some people had a good time in my personal theaters, so it could be a bit of a mixed bag, whether it really vibes with you or doesn't, depending on what sort of expectations you have with the colors that are all floating on throughout, how it handles certain subject matters. Will just go on the right end or wrong end, depending on what you're appropriately trying to accept from this movie. Other things where you're really trying to get something more out of it, but the horror and tension doesn't always win everyone over. And if you're not a hard horror film fan, then you're not necessarily gonna love the gore and blood that comes out of this one. And taking it into the negatives, I have to be honest, there's some things that just left an ill taste in my mouth. The way they dealt with this being a horror comedy didn't always have the right comedic elements that worked effectively for me. It didn't feel like it had the right approach. And even with its prologue or cold open, whatever you would call it, you're expecting Adam Scott to be a lot more prevalent within this film, and he doesn't show up later into the film. That's even not necessarily spoiling the film, but something that you should expect is he doesn't have a role later on, even though you could expect him to survive. And there's elements with Elijah Wood, his role within the film, they feel like there should be a lot more development to his character. How they set him up just throws him into the film, means something to what we're getting out of the main character. and a couple of his son, and just how that all floats into the mystery of the story, meaning to what all gets set up with the villain as a whole, that unfortunately just doesn't get nearly as developed as it could be. What we get out of the villain, the mystery behind him, just the build up and pacing to the story. There's an alternate path for the story where you get the young boys, and then a time jump 25 years later where you suddenly see the monkey come up again, and that's the mystery that's all resolving itself throughout how things come about. And by the way it builds upon its story, it just takes a hard shift going into the second half of the film. That 25 years later, there's a different tone and a different way of introducing all these new characters that just don't get as developed as I would like, and also introduces some thematic elements that, while it could be good, it just doesn't touch them in the right manner because it's a horror comedy, rather than dealing with them with a more serious tone that I feel like it should more appropriately touch on, at least for how I'm trying to interpret the story, how I'm trying to balance in where these character arcs are going, and where it leaves off on doesn't necessarily resolve certain character arcs that it should. It's just more so dealing with the horror and making some things comedic as possible without really feeling like it having the right comedy for me personally. So that's just really ultimately what takes it back, is just not really appropriately dealing with some of its tones. Yes, it can work for some people, but that thing, the way it deals with the underdeveloped things, the characters, elevator things, the sharp tone with its story, and just the progression of the story as a whole, feels weak in the way it's building upon things that come about, which ultimately leaves me disappointed to the nature of what I sort of had no expectations going into this film for. But while the horror satisfaction does deliver, there's something about everything else that builds upon its story that just feels incomplete with what it's trying to do with its picture, having a couple different ideas that don't necessarily fit together, and clapping them all together in a way that just doesn't necessarily vibe with the way that I personally expect it to go as a whole. So therefore, I have to rate The Monkey as simply 4.5 out of 10. So let me know down in the comments below what you thought of The Monkey. Did it work for you? Did it not work for you? Or is it somewhere right in the middle? Let me know all your thoughts and be respectful of other opinions down in the comments. Make sure to like this video if you enjoy it. Subscribe if you haven't already to join in the film culture community where we talk about the love of cinema as a whole. So that's just all, and make sure to do yourself a favor and go watch a movie.